On January 8, 2005, diver Dave slowly dived into the Bushman's Hole in South Africa under the watchful eye of the famous documentary filmmaker Gordon Hales. He wanted to do a shocking thing, salvaging a body that had been sleeping for 10 years from the darkness 271 meters underwater. What is surprising is that he never came back, and yes, Dave died in full view of the global live broadcast. So how exactly did Dave get killed? It's also weird to say he was killed to death by the corpse underwater. Bushman's Hole is located at Mount Carmel Farm, a private mountain farm in South Africa, deep in this green meadow with a chimney-like round pit. The mouth of the pit is not big, and 20 meters down from the mouth of the pit is a silent water hole, which is the entrance to the Bushman's Hole. At 234 meters long, 76 meters wide, and 282 meters deep, it is the third deepest freshwater cave in the world. It was first discovered in 1977 by an amateur diver named Mike, and a few years later, the famous diver Nuno Gomes successfully descended to the bottom of the cave and surveyed the entire floor. The entrance is too narrow, so the sunlight cannot shine underwater. Once you go deep into the Bushman's Hole, it is equivalent to falling into absolute darkness, and the great sense of claustrophobia makes people feel trance and full of danger. But it's this kind of excitement that attracts divers who like to push their limits. In 1993, a diver named Eben Leiden fainted 60 meters underwater, and although he was quickly rescued by another diver who was traveling with him, he was unable to recover. Of all those killed in Bushman's Hole, the most famous is Dion, a young man who loved all kinds of extreme sports. He hunted a stag at the age of 10 and started diving at the age of 17 with more than 200 diving experiences, and is a member of the South African Cave Diving Association. On December 17, 1994, Dion and his teammates descended to a position 59 meters underwater in Bushman's Hole. The captain at the time, Guillaume, immediately dived to get Dion up, but he couldn't keep up with the speed of his fall, so he had to give up. It would just be a suicidal chase, the captain explained in the accident report. Afterwards, Dion's parents tried their best to salvage their son's body, and they even paid a sky-high price for the recovery of the body. But unfortunately, no diver dared to risk his life to challenge the dangerous 300 meters of water in the Bushman's Hole. In desperation, the old couple could only rent a small submarine, but only Dion's diving helmet was found, and the whereabouts of the body were never known. Eventually, they had to give up and erect a monument to their son at the mouth of the Bushman's Hole. There was no body, so there was no autopsy, and no one knew exactly how Dion died. But many people suspected that he died of gas poisoning in diving equipment, which is commonly known as nitrogen drunkenness. Deepwater divers generally use closed-circuit, self-contained oxygen diving equipment. The so-called closed-circuit type, as the name suggests, is to place the diver in a completely enclosed environment, and breathing is also done inside the diving device. We all know that there is 21% oxygen in the air, and we need to inhale the air containing this 21% oxygen. And after consuming it in the human body, we will exhale the gas with only 16% oxygen. Between this exhalation and inhalation, there is a 5% oxygen difference between the inside and the outside. The function of closed-circuit diving equipment is to help divers replenish this 5% of oxygen and coordinate the proportion of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen in the diving equipment. But equipment is equipment after all, and it will encounter all kinds of failures. If there is too little oxygen, people will be starved of oxygen. Too much oxygen can lead to oxygen toxicity in the lungs, brain, and eyes, nausea, vomiting, and even fainting, not to mention carbon dioxide. Inhaling too much can lead to poisoning and coma. In addition to oxygen and carbon dioxide, nitrogen is also dangerous. Under the huge pressure of deep water, the human body will keep running, and the blood will incorporate more air, so that the oxygen and nitrogen in the blood will become more. When the nitrogen content in the blood exceeds the individual limit, it will produce a symptom similar to surgical anesthesia, which is nitrogen intoxication. Nitrogen drunkenness is the most feared condition encountered by divers. It will directly disturb people's consciousness. The divers can do some extremely dangerous actions, such as taking off the mask to breathe, or losing control of emotions, desperately diving into the deep water and never returning. What's even more terrifying is that nitrogen drunkenness is very common, and many diving gods have encountered this kind of crisis situation, such as the diving god Herbert Nitsch, who set a record of 253 2 meters of freediving. The nitrogen drunk occurred in the record-setting dive. Therefore, there is a high probability that Dion died of nitrogen drunkenness. Since then, countless divers have ventured into Bushman's Hole, and everyone knows that there is a dead soul sleeping under this water, but none of them have ever found the dead Dion underwater. However, perhaps as fate would have it, just 10 years later, in 2004, Dion's body magically appeared suddenly, and the person who found the body was Dave. Dave, whose full name is Dave Shaw, was born in 1955 in the small town of Katanning in Western Australia. And like Dion, Dave had been interested in adventure since he was a child, especially a love of flying. And sure enough, he grew up to become a pilot. Dave was introduced to diving in 1999 when he went with his son, but instead he became obsessed with diving. Dave was particularly fond of cave diving, and he was fascinated by shipwrecks and coral reefs in the water. Soon, Dave became a veteran of the diving world and began to challenge underwater caves around the world. And on that dive trip to Commodity Springs, he met Don Shirley, the owner of Commodity Springs. Don was also a fellow diver, and the two hit it off at first sight and broke world records together. In June 2004, Don took Dave to the Bushman's Hole, which was supposed to be a huge challenge for Dave, but unexpectedly, he went down very smoothly and reached the bottom of the Bushman's Hole in just 25 minutes. Dave was so excited that he was looking around at the bottom of the cave with a flashlight when he saw someone waving at him in the dark. Perhaps because he was too bold, Dave was not afraid and walked straight over, and soon he found that it was a corpse. It was clear that this was Dion, who was killed in Bushman's Hole 10 years ago. At this time, Dion's upper body already became bones, and the lower half of his body was buried in the mud. One arm was stretched out to the water, looking like he was beckoning. Almost instantly, Dave made a decision to take Dion's body back to the ground and hand it over to his parents. But Dion's body seemed to be stuck in something, and Dave pulled it twice without pulling it. He had to give up for the time being and marked the location with a guide rope hanging from the body. The first thing Dave did when he went ashore was to contact Dion's parents and tell them that he had found Dion and wanted to bring Dion's body back to the surface. The thought of seeing their son again in the lifetime made Dion's parents burst into tears. After getting permission from the old couple, Dave began to prepare for this operation to rescue the corpse as a friend. Don was also very supportive of Dave's idea. He helped Dave recruit a large number of good divers, formed a top rescue team, and designed an almost perfect rescue method for Dave: stepped rescue. That is, Dave went to the bottom of the cave alone. When he had bagged Dion's body and brought it to more than 60 meters, Don would take over as the second diver, bring the body to an altitude of 120 meters, and give it to the diver at the third level, then the fourth diver, then the fifth diver, until Dion returned to the surface. In order to ensure the safety of the entire rescue operation, Don also made perfect preparations. He planned to equip the water with 35 spare gas cylinders. This number can meet the needs of all divers to the greatest extent. He also arranged a sling system that allowed divers to be pulled ashore directly into a stretcher, even if they were in danger. Don also contacted the local police to set up a decompression chamber and hired a diving physiologist named Jack Mankies to escort the team. This rescue seemed to be in place, but if you want to talk about variables, there is also one, that is, the state of Dion's corpse. According to Dave, Dion's upper body had been bone-turned, but the condition of his lower body was still unknown. They didn't know how to deal with Dion's body underwater. For this reason, they went out of their way to visit a professional forensic doctor, and the forensic doctor gave the statement that Dion's lower body should also be completely ossified according to the environment of Bushman's Hole. After this toss, the time came to January 2005. On the night of January 1st, Dave's wife, Anne, drove 45 minutes to deliver her husband's diving equipment to the airport. For some reason, Anne was distracted until she watched Dave board the plane. On January 2nd, Dave landed in Johannesburg, South Africa, and joined Don, and the two went together to do the final preparations before the rescue. Rehearsing and acting, Don came to pretend to be a corpse to exercise Dave's speed of loading the corpse into a bag underwater. They rehearsed at a depth of about 20 meters underwater, and Dave did it very smoothly. Finally, on January 8th, under the global live broadcast arranged by Theo and Mary, the rescue officially began. Before going into the water, Director Gordon gave Dave a short interview, and in order to record the whole process of Dion's rescue, he also attached a small Sony HC-20 handheld camera to Dave's diving helmet. After that, Dave said, "See you in 20 minutes" to Don, and then jumped and completely disappeared from people's sight. 10 minutes after Dave entered the water, Don jumped on his heel, and he was going to 220 meters underwater to join Dave as a second diver. If all went well, Dion could see the light of day again after 80 minutes. However, the unexpected happened at this time. As soon as Don reached the meeting place, he immediately looked towards the bottom of the cave. Although he could not see Dave's shadow, he could vaguely glimpse the light of the flashlight that Dave had brought with him. But this light did not reassure Don at all. On the contrary, Don's heart was almost raised to his throat, and he clearly realized that Dave was definitely in trouble because the light had been staying in place and motionless. By this time, the time had come to 20 minutes when Dave was scheduled to join him, but the light still didn't move. Don immediately made a decision and dived into the bottom of the cave to save Dave. Don even prepared for the worst, bringing Dave's body back even if he died. But when he dived to a depth of 800 feet, he suddenly heard a loud sound of something shattering. After a closer look, he realized that the hammer controller on his left forearm was overwhelmed by the water pressure and broken. Without this thing, Don needed to manually give himself oxygen, which also meant that if he continued to dive, he would end up with the same fate as Dave. At this time, he suddenly remembered a topic he had talked to Dave by chance the night before. He asked Dave, "If something happens to you tomorrow, do you want me to save you?" And Dave answered, "Forget about me. It's better to die alone than two." Eventually, after a battle in his mind, Don had to give up on Dave, return the same way, and float to save himself. And after a few minutes, the flashlight that belonged to Dave completely disappeared. At this time, the people at the entrance of the cave did not know that a catastrophe had taken place underwater, and people were still expecting Dusan Stojkovic and Mark Andrews, who were in charge of the third level, to enter the water and meet Don 150 meters underwater. But when they got close to the depth of the target, they found that there was no light under the water at all, which meant that Don and Dave were probably in trouble. According to the original plan, they waited here for 4 minutes before ascending. In the process of ascending, they saw a light under the water. Soon, 85 meters underwater, they met Peter Herbst and Lo Vingerling, who were in charge of the fourth level. They picked up the board and sent the message, "There's a light underwater, but not sure who." Seeing such news, only Peter chose to continue diving because Don was his friend and he had to rescue Don. The other three floated up with a reminder board and went to the entrance of the cave to seek rescue. When Peter dived 120 meters underwater, he saw Don struggling to ascend, and Don immediately told Peter with a tip board, "Dave can't come back." At the same time, the other three divers returned to the surface one after another, and for some reason, the stone slab they passed up actually said, "There is no light underneath." At the moment of receiving the slate, the atmosphere on the shore froze instantly, and no one could have imagined that this heroic feat of global live broadcast would end in the death of two divers. However, at this time, Don, who was declared dead, was still trying to save himself underwater. Peter saw that Don was not in a good state, so he could only choose to take the first step and float to the surface for help. Don struggled to swim to a position about 50 meters underwater. At this time, he was dizzy, and even a small helium bubble formed in his left ear, and the severe pain eroded the nerves, and he could only keep telling himself to survive, to survive. Finally, when he ascended to about 6 meters underwater, he met Sander, a substitute diver who came to pick him up. Don successfully saved his life in this diving accident. However, due to the decompression sickness caused by the rapid ascent, he lost his balance forever. In the days that followed, news of Dave's death spread, and almost everyone believed that Dave, like Dion, would be buried under 271 meters of water, never to return to the surface. But fate may be so miraculous. Dave, who died, miraculously fulfilled his promise and finally brought Dion back. 2 weeks after the accident, Peter returned to Bushman's hole to work on the aftermath of the accident. He wanted to retrieve the diving equipment left in the cave. But just as he dived underwater, trying to pull the guideline up from the bottom of the water, he accidentally brought up Dave's body. And what hung under Dave's body was Dion's bones. In a sense, Dave fulfilled his promise to Dion's parents with his life. In order to save Dion, he even did not hesitate to turn himself into a corpse. Along with Dave's body, the Sony camera strapped to his helmet was fished up, and everyone knew that it recorded Dave's underwater death. A few days later, Don and Peter, who had survived, sat together holding a video camera and relived Dave's death. In fact, according to the camera recording, Dave's descent went so smoothly that he was even at Dion's body more than a minute earlier than scheduled. However, just as the corpse was being lifted, the unexpected happened. Contrary to the forensic doctor's prediction, Dion only had his upper body in a state of white ossification, while his lower body was relatively sealed because it was buried in the mud and miraculously turned into a semi-greasy substance similar to corpse wax. The floatiness of corpse wax was so good that the moment Dave dragged Dion out of the mud, Dion's body crashed into Dave's face. Dave was startled, and then Dion's half-rotting body kept circling around Dave like a puppet in a horror movie. In a panic, Dave couldn't quickly put Dion into a bag like a dress rehearsal. Because of this particular situation, Dave's whole body became tense, and his breathing rate increased. Off-screen, Don was well aware that this would allow Dave to inhale more oxygen and, of course, nitrogen. Even though he knew that the tragedy could not be changed, Don still burst into tears and kept muttering, "Don't breathe anymore. Please relax, my man." Unfortunately, Dave on the screen couldn't hear this, and soon he showed symptoms of nitrogen drunkenness and his movements became sluggish. After about 5 minutes, Dave finally realized that he couldn't pick up Dion as originally planned. He tried to float up to save himself, but the wetsuit was hooked by the guideline. Dave wanted to cut the guideline with scissors, but he was unconscious at this time. He lost his mobility and fell heavily on the mud at the bottom of the cave, motionless. As the clock ticked by, the oxygen in Dave's cylinder dwindled slightly, and finally, after 21 minutes, he stopped breathing, and his lungs were filled with carbon dioxide. Don watched his best friend's death, watched the tragedy happen, watched Dave die in the same position as Dion. When the camera squeezed out the last trace of electricity and fell silent, Don's tears had already soaked his face. The picture freezed on Dave's lying position. He was a man who made a living by embracing the stars and the sea, and finally merged with the darkness. Today, at the mouth of the Bushman's hole, Dion's tombstone stands opposite Dave's. When the sun penetrates the water, the two shadows overlap at a depth of 271 meters. Dave's death, or sacrifice, may seem great to ordinary people, but in the diving world, there is a different set of theories. They believe that Dave's sacrifice for a corpse is completely unnecessary, even absurd and redundant. And they also compiled the accident into the diving textbook, marked it in red font, saying that it was a fatal mistake that could not be reproduced. But don't forget, it is these two corpses who have completed the lifting beyond life and death and the ups and downs at the moment when they were entangled with each other and saw the light of day. Human beings use the most absurd way to perform the most solemn tribute to life. The live camera failed to record the return of the hero, but accidentally captured the most complex facet of human nature. And Dave showed the world that the density of the human soul can surpass the pressure of the deep sea. Should we celebrate the promise of transcending life and death, or should we condemn the madness of breaking the margin of safety? It can only be said that when rational calculation meets the brilliance of human nature, it is a question that can never be solved.